On the morning of the 23rd of September, Wellesley brought his army just round here. Like Wellesley, I'm going to take to horse to be able to see things better, though I doubt if this lady looked much like his favourite charger. The men were just making camp when some locals came in with the news that the whole Maratha army was just behind that ridge. For Wellesley, it was a time of decision and risk. He could attack immediately and take them by surprise, or he could wait a day or two until the whole British force was concentrated. Being Wellesley, there was only one decision. He'd attack at once. He was embarking on the hardest battle of his entire career. The first problem facing Wellesley was one of topography. He was on one side of the river, the Marathas on the other. Wellesley wanted to avoid attacking them straight from the front, but instead to attack from a flank, putting them off balance. That meant he must cross the river to the east. But all his guides told him it was too deep to cross. Wellesley wouldn't rest until he'd checked it for himself. One of the reasons why Wellesley didn't believe the guides was that he could see two villages, close together, but on opposite banks of the river. He later wrote that there had to be some habitual means of communication between them. He staked everything on the guides being wrong. Wellesley and his army arrived at the River Kaitna to find the water flowing fast. Wellesley was the first man to kick his horse on into the river. But he was right. There was a ford. The water was no more than 4 feet deep at its worst. Easy for the cavalry and not much of a problem for the infantry. Wellesley led his army across the river. He had succeeded in surprising the Marathas, who hastily regrouped to face him. On the Maratha side of the river, Wellesley formed up his army in line, infantry in front and cavalry behind. Ahead of them, his soldiers could see the skyline filled with the Maratha army. Over 100 cannon and infantry who outnumbered them by perhaps 5 to 1. It must have been a terrifying sight. The Marathas had already opened fire. The British replied, but they were badly outgunned. With cannonballs whistling around him, Wellesley rode from one end of his line to the other, speaking to all his commanding officers personally, and launched the attack.
Charge! Let it down now! Let it down! Reload! Gun ready!
All was going well, but then came disastrous news. Up here, at the end of the line nearest the fortified village of Assaye, the 74th Regiment was being cut to pieces. It had pushed too close to the cannon defending the village and was then attacked by infantry and cavalry. Its men formed square behind a barrier made up of the bodies of dead enemy. But relief was at hand. A cavalry charge led by the gallant Colonel Maxwell came to the rescue of the 74th and scattered the Marathas. The battle was still not over. Wellesley, who'd already lost 2 horses, one of them run through with a spear, now rallied his scattered troops and sent them back in tight formation to deal the killing blow. The Marathas broke and fled, leaving all their guns behind them. The Battle of Assaye had been won. I can understand now, although frankly I couldn't before, why he reckoned that Assaye was his most difficult battle. It's a remarkable achievement to move an army that far over such a difficult country, and then to carry out a complicated manoeuvre in the face of a numerous and determined adversary. It's really a tackle-out battle with no safety net, and he does it, he judges it right, and makes it work. Assaye was a turning point for the British in India. and a personal triumph for Wellesley as a general. But like all victories, it had a cost. 1 in 4 of Wellesley's men had been killed or wounded.
The Maratha losses were just as high. It was the bloodiest battle that Wellesley was ever to take part in. At nightfall, the surviving British dropped exhausted and slept amongst the ungathered dead. Wellesley for some time was sleepless and sat with his head on his knees. Soon afterwards, he was to write, "I acknowledge that I should not like again to see such loss, even if accompanied by such a gain." On September the 24th, 1803, the morning after the battle, Arthur Wellesley left Assaye and came here, to the fortified town of Ajunta, bringing with him the British wounded. Within the secure walls of the town, he organized a field hospital and left a small garrison to protect it.
Wellesley and most of his army marched away to the north, and over the next few months won another pitched battle and took the key stronghold of Gwalior. There was to be yet more fighting, but the power of the Maratha Confederacy was really broken.
For the 2 years following his victory at Assaye, Wellesley returned to rule in Mysore. But by 1805, he'd had enough of India. "I have served as long in India," he wrote, "as any man ought." However, he had acquired a small fortune and was a Knight of the Order of the Bath. Mornington, too, was going home. Between them, the Wellesley brothers had fundamentally changed the status of the British in India. What had started as a matter of commerce was fast becoming an empire. They left behind them an India which, for good or bad, would be under British rule for the next 140 years. Wellesley arrived in India as an insignificant lieutenant colonel and left a seasoned general. India had been the making of him. He later said, "I understood as much of military matters when I came back from India as I have ever done since." He had, however, been away for nearly a decade. It might not be easy to find a place at home.
He'd now got money and a knighthood, but in England he was still an outsider. He'd still got something left to prove. But perhaps now he could marry Kitty, the girl he hadn't seen for 10 years, the girl he hadn't even been able to write to.
In the next few years, Wellesley would become Wellington. His reputation and his fortune would be made. But he still had many hard lessons to learn.